You are listening to The Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. The filibuster is threatening to block a great deal of the Democratic Party's legislative wish list. What is the history, the function, and the future of the filibuster? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. The U.S. Senate is a unique legislative body in that it often requires a supermajority of 60 votes in favor of legislation for a bill to pass. This is due to a historic institution called the filibuster. But the filibuster, as we commonly know it from films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, is not exactly like we think. Instead, it's evolved into a means to ensure the minority party can easily block legislation from passing with a majority. Today, we discuss the history of the filibuster, its purpose in democratic governance, and the future of the practice. Our guest is our old friend, Jeremi Suri, professor in the Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He holds the Matt Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs and is the author of The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and Foreign Policy Breakthroughs, Cases in Successful Diplomacy. Jeremy, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Doug. Always happy to chat with you.
So when we teach the filibuster to high school students, we usually show them Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and this scene of a senator holding the floor because of this extreme, conviction. That isn't really what the filibuster is, though, is it? What is the filibuster?
So it has become a mechanism for the minority in the Senate to, on many issues, prevent any progress unless they get their way. They hold the majority hostage. And the way it works is that they can prevent anything from coming to the floor, even a discussion. So the Republicans never actually filibustered the idea of a legislation for a January 6th commission. They filibustered any discussion of the possibility of having a legislation. So it becomes a way of muzzling the Senate unless one side can get the consent of at least 10 members of the minority party. If you only have 50, if you are 52, then it's 8. You need 60 rather than 50, basically. But that's a modern phenomenon. Historically, the filibuster was rarely used in the 19th century. And then when used slightly more often in the 20th century until the 1970s, it was the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where most famously Strom Thurmond stands and speaks for more than 24 hours to stop any progress on a civil rights bill in the 1950s. But we've moved to a world since the 1970s where the Senate has rules that allow senators to indicate that they're going to filibuster. If there aren't enough votes for cloture for 60, the Senate just moves on to another topic. It's called a two-track system. And it makes it pretty easy to filibuster. All the minority leader has to do is say, sorry, I have 41 people who don't like this legislation. Move on.
And historically, where did it come from? Because, it's kind of axiomatic. I think most people probably already know. It's not in the Constitution.
Not at all. And that's a really important point, Doug. I think everyone needs to recognize that the rules by which the Senate and the House operate are the rules they make. And they can be changed at any time by the Senate and the House by a majority vote, unless someone filibusters that majority vote. The filibuster actually comes from a pretty innocuous decision. It's a classic case, the sort of thing we love studying as historians, where a decision is made in a thoughtless way at one moment, and it has implications for the next 200 years. So Aaron Burr in 1798, when he is the vice president of the United States, he basically withdraws or gets rid of the rule that allows for a senator to call to previous question. This is basic Robert's Rules of Order. If we're in a committee meeting and you make a point and I think it's time for us to actually vote on the topic that you're talking about, I say call to previous question. And if a majority of the people in our committee meeting say, yes, let's call the previous question, then we actually vote on whatever the topic is. They eliminate that from the Senate rules, which means there's no way to stop a senator from speaking. If you take the floor as a senator, you can speak theoretically as long as you wish. And that means that one senator, in theory, can stop the entire Senate from moving on to anything else. The reason for this is because the Senate wants to be a place of free speech. It wants to be a place of open debate. And the mythology, and you'll hear people defending this today without any empirical basis, is that this is supposed to allow for more free speech. It never really does. What it actually does is it allows a small group to stop others from speaking on issues because they just hold the floor. Imagine if in your committee meeting you had a misbehaving faculty member, I know that's unthinkable, right? Who just kept going on and on and on, and you couldn't stop them from speaking. That would not be encouraging free speech. That would be stopping any real discussion. And that's what it does. Through most of the 19th century, it's rarely invoked, very, very rarely invoked. It's used much more in the 20th century. It is worth saying, Doug, though, when it is used, in the 19th century, it's used really for one issue: to protect slavery, to protect any and prevent any discussion by Southern senators, preventing any discussion from other senators about any kind of modification to slavery, any kind of limitation on the power of slave owners and the fugitive slave law and other elements that allow Southerners to protect their slaves even when they go north.
So since it requires a supermajority, it seems to me that the filibuster is really a fundamentally conservative and kind of a broad understanding of conservative versus progressive type of institution, in that it tries to block the institution from taking steps without an overwhelming majority. Isn't there a value to that, though? That the narrative you always hear is Benjamin Franklin's famous line about how, you know, the Senate serves as the cooling saucer to try to cool the passions of the day.
I think that that's an argument in principle, but I don't think it really plays out that way historically. The purpose the filibuster serves in the early 19th century, soon after it's created in 1798, is for what is a very small, clubby group of men. It encourages them to come to consensus. And maybe it works in that small setting a little bit. And there's a kind of rule they follow that they don't use it very much. You're not supposed to, as a senator, put a filibuster on the table, start a filibuster just because you don't like a little piece of legislation. It's really to be used only in extreme circumstances. And it's part of the clubbiness. The Senate was a club. Even as late as the early 20th century, it was still a club of older white men from similar backgrounds. The problem is, though, as the country grows, as we get into the 1830s and 40s, as we become more diverse, it's no longer the same kind of club. It's not a small club. It's a much bigger group with different interests. And it makes it almost impossible to reconcile interests between different groups, because there's no incentive, if you are in the minority or you feel you'll fall into the minority, to give in. Why would you prefer to compromise rather than prevent the other side from getting anything that would be worse for you and keeping the status quo that's better than the change that might come for you? So that's why it becomes very conservative, but it's conservative not in a sense that encourages consensus. It's conservative in the sense of reactionary, classic reactionary politics, holding us back. It's what some scholars in your field would call, right, a veto point, right, a veto point in the political system. And that's why senators are rare to use it in the 19th century, because they see it is not a tool that is that useful in too many cases. And as I said, you can count the number of filibusters from the 19th century on your fingers. You can't count them on your fingers and toes, even for the last few months.
In the 19th century, when it was used, it was most commonly used to help preserve the institution of slavery. And then in the 20th century, prior to the most recent, say, 10, 15 years, which we'll get into, it seems like it was most frequently used on issues of civil rights. Is that accurate? And then if so, I mean, obviously race is playing a pretty substantial role in here. Is the filibuster racist?
So largely, yes. There is a notable exception that's very important in the history of the filibuster. Through the 19th century, there's no cloture. There's no vote to stop the filibuster. So if you wanted to stop a filibuster in 1870, you just had to wait till the person collapsed. That you had to wait them out. And if there were 10 people who were part of the filibuster, you had to wait them out. And that's why the Southern states before the Civil War, when they filibuster, they're able to get away with it, because no one really wants to wait that long for these guys to collapse when they're just speaking and speaking and speaking. The Cloture Rule is created in the wake of World War I, because there are a group of senators who try to use the filibuster to prevent the United States from funding and fighting World War I. So it is actually used by isolationists. And that's where the Cloture Rule is created. It's created because the vast majority of the senators did want to go to war, and there were enough to agree that they would create this rule. Originally, the Cloture Rule is 67 votes. It's then later moved to 60. So we've slowly chipped away at it. But with that exception, with the exception of the filibusters around World War I, it is predominantly then used in the 20th century, not to protect slavery, because there isn't slavery anymore, but to protect white supremacy, to prohibit anti-lynching legislation, to prohibit legislation that would eliminate public segregation, to eliminate legislation that would guarantee the right to vote, and eliminate poll taxes. And Lyndon Johnson has to work, he would say, as hard as he ever worked, which is really hard, to get past those filibusters. That's really the impediment in 1957 that finally gets us a Civil Rights Act, and in 1964 and 65, Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. And it honestly, it takes a war from Lyndon Johnson. He's got to buy off people. He's got to pressure them. It is the impediment then, as it is now, to civil rights.
So the filibuster, it appears, is being used a lot more frequently. Is it fair to say that this use of the filibuster as extensively as it is tied pretty closely to the current Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell? Is the blame kind of laid at his feet?
Yes, in part. I think there's a rise in the use of the filibuster really as we get into the late 80s and early 1990s, and then it skyrockets from there. So maybe he takes a trend of increased use and then multiplies it many, many times over. I think the reason the filibuster gets used more is because in the 1980s and 90s, there's a movement in the U.S. Senate to undertake some major structural reforms to our democracy that are very threatening. And most of them do still circle around civil rights, DC statehood, for example. And so there's a desire by the Republican Party, for the most part, but not always the Republican Party, sometimes the Democratic Party, to use the filibuster to stop movement on those issues. I'm not sure partisanship is creating that. The filibuster might actually be contributing to the partisanship, because you have no incentive. This is why I think the filibuster is such a bad thing historically. It creates a disincentive for you to compromise. It creates more of an incentive for you to form your tribe. And if you can get enough people in your tribe, you don't have to have a majority. You can wield your power. You can hold things up. So it's a disincentive to compromise. Whereas if you have to get 50, then you need to compromise. You need to compromise on legislation, not just say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to stop you from having any discussions.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the history and the feature of the filibuster with Jeremi Suri of the University of Texas, Austin. And one of the more interesting features of American governance is the ability to block the majority party from being able to pass legislation. I think of a number of European systems, certainly parliamentary systems, where when you win an election, you get to pass what you run on, and then if the voters don't like it, they vote you out next time. Whereas in the US, actually one of the more common complaints is that politicians make promises, but they don't keep the promises. But it seems like a lot of times that's because the minority party can actually block passing those promises. So is that unique, to the US, that a majority is not really a majority?
It's a point I explored in The Impossible Presidency, and the new book I'm finishing also circles around this. Some elements of American society are more democratic than almost any other in the world. Our First Amendment rights. We have more First Amendment, more free speech rights than English citizens have, for example, right? But there are other parts of our system that are terribly undemocratic, and you've beautifully hit on one of them, Doug. Our system is set up to make it very, very hard for a majority to get things done. And this has three really nefarious historical outcomes. First, it allows a minority of white male slaveholders and then white supremacists in the South to wield inordinate influence in our system. And then that gets reinforced by gerrymandering. It gets reinforced by a Senate that represents territory, not people. So there's a piling on towards certain minority groups that goes back to the Constitution. This is a cancer in our system. Slavery is not the only element of this, right? It's the compromise to bring that part of the country in, and that element of it, right? This is a bad thing about constitutions. On this case, the English have a point on us, right? Maybe if you don't have a written constitution, you can change these things more easily. Second nefarious effect, or second element of this, is that it actually then encourages the president to act more unilaterally. And there's this irony where members of Congress, you'll hear them complain about the president issuing so many executive orders. The truth is, if you study this as a historian, most presidents would prefer to get what they want done through legislation. They understand that works better. First of all, they want Congress to be responsible for it, not just them. And it has more longevity. It's harder to change. The Affordable Care Act has remained the law of the land because it's a piece of legislation, not an executive order. The Dreamers Act was an executive order, so it's easier to turn that around. But presidents turn, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they turn to executive orders, which aren't in the Constitution either, by the way, because the legislation is stymied. And that's a real problem. It encourages too much executive governance. And then there's the third element of it that I think is probably the most problematic of all of this, is that it discourages the solving of our problems through policy. We tend to try to solve them other ways. We look to market solutions. We look to all these other alternatives, which sometimes make sense, but we don't take the very serious, obvious policy avenues that we can take. And so our policy making is not as rich and dynamic as it could be. Taking the filibuster out of that would at least remove one of the anti-democratic obstacles to our system. And less people worry that if we got rid of the filibuster, all of a sudden 50% would be doing everything they want and the other 50% would not get what they want. There's so many other checks. I mean, imagine if the Senate could, if the Democrats in the Senate today could, with 50 plus the vice president, push through all the legislation they want to push through, whether you like it or not. Think of all the other impediments that still exist after that. So the fear of a tyranny of the majority is overstated by the minority to protect the minority interests.
What immediately came to mind is one way in which we replace this, the policymaking mechanism tends to be through the courts.
Yes, that's
then to use that as a transition. One area where the filibuster has been removed has been on judicial appointments, including the Supreme Court. And so is that coincidental? Is it ironic or whatever, that because of the filibuster, a lot more of these cases are being played out in the courts? And this is one area where the filibuster actually has been removed, is in judicial appointments.
Right. So this process begins when Republicans under Mitch McConnell's leadership, as the minority in the Senate in 2009, say that they're not going to confirm, they're going to filibuster many of Barack Obama, President Obama's nominees for different cabinet positions, which is almost unheard of. There had been a long tradition where the senator from a given state has the right to object to a potential judge appointment from their state, but not that you could object to the person the president wants as Secretary of the Treasury because you don't like their position on abortion or something like that. As a consequence, Harry Reid, who's the majority leader, then eliminates the filibuster for appointments below the level of Supreme Court justice. Mitch McConnell then uses that as an excuse when the Republicans have the majority under Trump to eliminate the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. And it's really important. Right now, McConnell is defending the filibuster. If we kept the filibuster that he seems to love for Supreme Court appointments, we would have no Neil Gorsuch, no Brett Kavanaugh, and no Amy Coney Barrett. All three of them are approved with numbers far less than what you would need if they could be filibustered. It's in the low 50s for each of them. And so 51, I think, with Kavanaugh, in fact, right? So this is, the filibuster has been chipped away in those areas. It wasn't a problem before, not because you had more moderates appointed to these positions. Antonin Scalia was appointed when there was still a filibuster. It was more because there was a tradition of showing deference to the president. And it's when that tradition is broken and the filibuster is used more that then you have to start peeling it away. And that's why today, so many of us who are historians say it's time to get rid of the filibuster. It's always been a problem. You won't find historians saying it ever works well, but it wasn't a problem that rose to this level because it was a bad weapon that was very infrequently used. Now it's a bad weapon that's being used more often. So we better disarm. We better take it out of the closet. And that's where I think we are today.
Now, each example you cited, particularly the last two, Harry Reid with lower court appointments and then Mitch McConnell with Supreme Court appointments, the filibuster was removed with 50% of the vote, with 50% of the Senate. So you can't filibuster getting rid of the filibuster. So the Democrats have 50 votes plus one. Why do we still have the filibuster?
That's a very good question. I think some of it has to do with the fact that one or two of those 50 plus one votes, particularly Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, it's not that they really like the filibuster. It's that he doesn't like some of the things that'll be done if the filibuster is eliminated. And he doesn't think his constituents like some of those things. So the filibuster is a useful excuse. And that's why I do think the voting rights debate is a really interesting one, because he is exposing himself. He can say all he wants that, well, it would be a bad idea to eliminate the filibuster even for voting. We did it in a small way. We could, as we've done for judges, we could just say you can't filibuster a voting rights piece of legislation. His Manchin's response would be, well, but then that'll give the Republicans reason and justification when they're in the majority to eliminate more of the filibuster. They're going to do that anyway. They've already done that to get 3 Supreme Court justices appointed, right? Why would they not do it for other issues? So it's not a compelling argument. I think what motivates Manchin and the few Democrats, it's only 1 or 2 or 3 maybe, who are holding up getting rid of the filibuster, at least around voting rights and DC statehood and other things, is they don't actually like the legislation that'll be passed afterwards. And they need to be held accountable for that. The Democratic Party is a much more diverse party. I don't just mean racially and ethnically. Of course, it is more racially and ethnically diverse. It represents a much wider, diverse constituency in the country. That's a strength and a weakness of the party. And here's where we're seeing some of that weakness. So Manchin almost doesn't want the party to be able to do what he's claiming he wants the party to do.
This last point gets me thinking, something I always wrestle with is how much, when we discuss issues, whether it's the filibuster or other principles, electoral college, et cetera, are we really talking about principles of governance? And the debate really rests with this principle of governance versus I have legislation I want to pass. And if the best way to pass that is for the states, I'll support the states. It's not really about federalism. If the best way to do this is to get rid of the filibuster, I'll get rid of the filibuster. Is it really about the principles of governance, or is it really about the policy itself?
I mean, it's not a pure dichotomy, right? It's not one or the other, but I think it's mostly about power. And I think the historical record's pretty clear on that. Principles do matter. I think most politicians, not all today, but most politicians do have some core principles. They do have some red lines they won't cross. We saw this with many of the Republican senators who wanted nothing to do with questioning the electoral vote count, right? They didn't want to go down that road. They can say all kinds of horrible things about Joe Biden and even allow Trump to tell lies about the election, but they weren't going to vote to decertify and get into that mess. That for some of them, I think, was a principled line. They weren't going to go there. But with the exception of some principled lines, most actors on both sides of the aisle are pursuing what they think are the right things to do for power and for their constituents. And they use procedural arguments to enable themselves and disable their opponents. And the best example of this, by the way, is the 1876 election. I hate to take us back to history. I was just writing a chapter about this, actually. This is an election we still don't know who won, Tilden or Hayes. And if you follow the arguments, and we have to have an electoral commission, and it really comes down to 2 days before inauguration till a deal is made to make Hayes president, you can see both parties making arguments on either side based on the state that they're in. So states where the Democrats think there are fraudulent votes by Republicans, they say we should be able to throw those votes out. But the states where the Republicans think they're fraudulent votes, they know the Democrats don't want those thrown out in those areas. Hypocritical arguments are made both ways. We've seen that, right? McConnell defended the use of the getting rid of the filibuster so he could get a Supreme Court nominees. He even defended not taking on a president's nominee when it was Obama, and then taking it on later and closer to the election when it was Trump, an impeached president, a president who we knew was in some ways violating the law already. It's not just McConnell. He's maybe the most explicit of this, but procedure is generally used by people, not 100%, 80 to 90% to get what they want.
A number of progressives have been critical that President Biden has not been more vocal about getting rid of the filibuster. He's complained about it. He's certainly thrown his support behind some of the different voter rights legislation, the John Lewis Act and S1, the Senate 1 bill coming out, but he hasn't really committed his presidency to getting rid of the filibuster. So kind of a two-part question. Do you agree? And what does this mean for the future of the filibuster, at least in the next, 2 years or so?
It's a great question. I do think Joe Biden is a creature of the Senate that we've just described. And he remembers, and maybe he's misremembering, but he remembers a period of bipartisanship. He's friendly with some of the people on the other side. So he's attached to the filibuster in some ways that we are attached to the normal procedures we have in our places of work, right? Even if we don't like them, they're comfortable. They're comfortable old shoes. But I think there's something more to it than that. I think he's having conversations with his friends who are members of the Senate. That was not true for really the prior president, even the one before that. Obama was not very close to many people in Congress. Biden, these are his friends, especially some of the Republicans. And I think he knows that behind the scenes, he actually has a little more support from them. And he's trying to translate that. I think there are a number of Republicans who might not like everything in the Democratic legislation, but actually agree. Certainly believe that there's no evidence of fraud. They're afraid to say it in public. And he's trying to nudge them forward. I don't know if he'll succeed, but I think that's what he's trying to do. He will argue, maybe correctly, that assuming we have this bipartisan deal on infrastructure, that actually happened, that's what worked there. And it's a fine balance, Doug. You and I study this. There's no real formula for this, right? You have to bring the hammer sometimes. And sometimes, you have to bring the carrots and the cake and whatever it is. And I think he's working through that. And we're lucky to have a president now who understands that. Whether he'll succeed, I don't know. I'm certain that he and everyone around him is absolutely committed to getting voting rights legislation through one way or another. They need that. They recognize that, but I don't think they have yet figured out how to do that. And that's going to be one of the dramas for the next 6 months, right? It's got to be done really, not necessarily before the summer recess, but certainly by the end of the fall. They've got to have something in place.
And that is true. And I also appreciate your prediction, non-prediction, to say that it's not clear cut, but certainly this is a complicated issue, and it's going to be one that we're going to be watching very closely. We've been discussing the filibuster, the history of the filibuster, its purpose or lack thereof, and the potential for its removal in the future. Our guest has been Jeremi Suri, professor in the Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He's the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs and the author of The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and Foreign Policy Breakthroughs, Cases in Successful Diplomacy. Jerry, thank you very much.
I enjoyed it as always.
Thank you.